Hello, viewers, and welcome to Sahara TV. And today we have Mr. Robert Mahoney, the Executive Director of CPJ. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so how did you find your way here? I have to ask.
You have to, well, we have offices very near you, so it was just a walk across a very busy and hot New York street.
Hot indeed. So today you launched something very important. Tell me about it.
Yeah, well, every year the Committee to Protect Journalists honors courageous journalists around the world. And this year we just announced the 4 winners of our 2019 awards, which will be presented to them in November, later this year in New York City at a big event.
Yeah, I've heard. I've never been, but definitely.
Oh, you should come.
Yes, we'll definitely come this year.
That's great.
So who are some of the winners?
Well, we have winners from Africa, from Tanzania, a very courageous journalist called Maxence Mello, who runs an online forum and discussion group called Jamii Forums in Tanzania.
Yes.
And he is one of those journalists that, represents independent and free journalism in the face of what I would call increasing authoritarianism around the world. And the journalists that we are honoring are all coming from countries where press freedom is under attack and where, free expression is going backwards. They're from Tanzania, from Brazil, from India, from Nicaragua, and Pakistan.
Okay, amazing. So I'm pretty sure those winners are going to be in New York for the awards?
Yes, yeah, they will be.
Okay, so what made you choose those winners specifically?
Well, we want to highlight every year that we do this, and we've been doing it now for many years. We want to highlight those journalists who are doing really, difficult work in the face of difficult conditions to keep press freedom alive and to keep informing citizens, because this is about giving us news and information.
Yes.
And all those countries represent countries which have independent media, which have a press, but where conditions for journalists are getting worse, and where leaders are becoming more and more intolerant of criticism and independent reporting, and are using social media in particular to push back against journalists, to harass them, to smear them, to ruin their reputations.
Okay, amazing. Well, speaking of which, I know a lot of even Nigerians have faced, backlash from, the government and so on and so forth. What do you think needs to happen for journalists, to have press freedom?
Well, journalists obviously need to keep doing the work that they're doing, but we, as journalists around the world, I've been a journalist all my life.
Okay.
We need to, make sure that we're working together to support our colleagues when they're in trouble, because governments do listen, and we do have a louder voice when we all shout together than if we do individually. And Nigeria is a country where CPJ has worked a lot. I myself, when I was a journalist, I worked in West Africa, and I covered Nigeria a long time ago, but nevertheless, some of the problems still persist. And those journalists in countries like Nigeria that are doing good work need our help. So we want to shine a spotlight on any violations that they receive, any problems that they receive when they're doing their work. And a lot of them get into trouble because they're doing investigative reporting. They're looking into subjects like corruption and crime and the connections between corrupt officials and criminals. All that kind of work, which is really hard, difficult, and dangerous, and they really need our support.
Yeah, so in what ways do you think the government can support, journalists?
Well, first thing they can do is to live up to their own commitments. I mean, a lot of these countries that we work in have constitutions which guarantee a free press and a free expression, but the government doesn't really enforce that. They can make sure that journalists are not harassed by security forces, that the courts are independent, so that you can't bring frivolous suits against journalists to try to shut them down, and to take complaints when journalists and press freedom groups like mine bring complaints, to take them seriously. And we will hold those leaders to account. When they travel outside the country, you know, we will go meet with them. We will talk to them. We will make sure that cases of journalists that are in trouble are always on their radar.
Amazing. So obviously, there are obstacles journalists face, but there are also rewards. You know, what are some of the rewards of being a journalist?
Well, when you get a good story and it gets attention and it actually has an impact, that's a great feeling. So look at the great work that journalists have been doing in investigative work, such as the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, where they're working together across countries, across continents, unearthing secrets, you know, exposing corruption and wrongdoing, and seeing a real positive outcome, like people going to jail as a result of their work, or people being called out, losing their jobs if they're corrupt officials and politicians. I think those are the real rewards. And knowing that you're doing your job. What's your job as a journalist? Your job is to inform the public.
Yes.
To give citizens information that will help them make decisions and keep democracy alive. Because, you know, when anyone wants to clamp down on democracy, some of the first people that they get rid of are journalists.
Speaking of which, I'm going to switch it over to now the U.S. Obviously, you know what's going on in the U.S. And, you know, recently Trump made some remarks towards congresswomen, you know, and I believe the court even went behind him in terms of him blocking people off of Twitter, which is, you know, the First Amendment. How do you feel about that?
Look, I think that politicians will make remarks. I think that the job of the press here is to report it, to tell the truth, to call it out, to say what it is, not to in any way, you know, pull its punches when reporting. And I think that the press here is doing a better job of reporting what Trump is doing. We at the Committee to Protect Journalists have set up something that we call a press freedom tracker, a U.S. press freedom tracker, which is a website which we are partnering with other groups, which tracks attacks against journalists, attempts to exclude journalists or slander them. And we've never had to do that work before. But since President Trump took office, there are so many attacks on journalists. You know, he's called journalists the enemies of the people. And we feel that we need to document this and to have a set of facts that we can use, that we can present to the public and say, listen, you know, journalists in this country are facing a tough time. The press is facing a tough time. Here are specific incidents where either, you know, journalists have been stopped from working, or they've been harassed or attacked, and we've never had to do that before. There's always been an understanding here that the press could do its work. But, you know, if you don't defend press freedom in the U.S., how can you credibly go and call out other governments when they are harassing or attacking their journalists? So we feel like we need to make sure that you know, the standards that we want to see upheld around the world are upheld here.
Amazing. I totally agree. So, what changes would you like to see in terms of press freedom, whether in the U.S. or around the world?
I would like to see us as journalists and as people that value democracy and the rule of law push back against this, what I will call creeping authoritarianism, you know, where leaders are more and more shrinking the space for press freedom and free expression, whether it's by attacking journalists directly online, as we've seen in Africa, but also in the Philippines and in India, where some of our awardees for this prize have come from. I would like to see us defend press freedom more vigorously, because I think it's under attack.
I, once again, agree with you. So, you know, the awards in November. Tell me more about it. What should people look forward to?
Well, we have every year this big gala dinner in New York where we bring journalists from around the world. We expose them to all the domestic U.S. media. They get to be able to talk about their country and their work. They usually get interviewed by the U.S. newspapers and networks, and it's a great platform for journalists, whether it's from Africa or Asia, to come to the U.S. and use that platform to publicize the issues that they're facing at home. And their host countries, their home country, they take notice.
Yes.
They get called out in front of a world audience. This is a great opportunity to bring publicity, international publicity, onto the problems that journalists face in their own countries, whether it's in terms of the attacks that they face or help that they need. And we take them also to Washington, D.C. as well as New York.
Okay.
And there they can meet with politicians and diplomats and the think tanks and institutions there, again, to publicize what it is that they're doing. And hopefully, amidst all this, they'll have a little bit of fun too, and get to see New York, and
Fun is always
maybe catch a Broadway show, or just walk around and soak it up. A little bit of relief. And sometimes some of these journalists are working in really hard conditions.
Yes.
It could be that their life is under threat. It could be that they're just working all the time under constant stress, and it's a great little break for them too, I hope.
Yes. You mentioned threats and stress for journalists, of course. What are some of the most bizarre stories that you've heard?
Well, I mean, bizarre in the sense that the threats are real, and they take various forms. There are death threats that journalists have, particularly some of the journalists that we've had from Mexico or Pakistan. They've had very credible threats against their physical safety. And one thing that we've noticed, and this is global, this is not specific to any region, is a more and more online harassment, trolling. By that I mean that individuals who are often anonymous, sometimes it's even robots that are doing it,
Wow.
are sending really nasty messages, smearing people, accusing them of crimes which will alienate them from their own community. Sometimes, I don't know whether your audience is aware of the term doxing, which is now happening, where your enemies online, because they want to shut you up, they will publish personal information about you online, such as your address, sometimes your social security number. They'll put your picture up, and the idea is that other people will then start attacking you. And we've even had instances where there's another term which I've learned in the last year or two called swatting, which refers to police SWAT, special forces squads.
Yes.
Sometimes they will target a journalist by calling the police in the middle of the night and saying, there are terrible screams coming from this house. We believe that this person is attacking his partner or his wife. And then the police will come and knock down your door. This has happened a few times. So these are really nasty new developments in the ways that journalists can be harassed. And why? To shut them up. It's all about censoring people whose reporting you don't like, whose opinions you don't like. But these are journalists. These are not political opponents. These are people that are doing reporting. So these are some of the nasty threats that now happen. And I have to say, and it's disturbing, is a lot of the targets of this are women. Because a lot of these threats and a lot of this online trolling is linked with gender violence, particularly against women.
Definitely. That's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
Very unfortunate.
And that's the kind of the ugly flip side of the technology. The technology has enabled lots and lots of journalists to be published and to publish themselves on new platforms, like Sahara Reporters, for example, right?
Yes.
So when that first came out, and I remember when Sahara Reporters was first launched, it was exciting. Here were new technologies. You didn't have to rely on state broadcasters and licensed radio frequencies or have a lot of money to own a printing press. Here you could start up. and that was great. We all applauded it, and there's lots and lots of news outlets around the world now which didn't exist 10,
Back
15
then,
years ago.
yes.
The flip side of that is that all those enemies, whether it's the president of the state or whether it's just the local
Citizens,
businessman,
yeah.
can turn around and use the same technology against you, either as an organization or as an individual. They can hack your website, they can bring it down, which happens.
Yeah,
They
we've
do
had,
these DDoS
yes.
attacks. They can do all that online trolling and smearing that I was talking about against individual journalists, and then they can infect the whole news environment with fake news, with false news, pushing out lies. And lies, as you know, as a journalist, push out the truth very easily, and we all will find that we end up believing things that are not true and ignoring things that are true. And so there's a constant battle between the sort of the light and the dark of the new technology, which we're involved with all the time.
It's definitely a battle. Speaking of lies, how can people, as a citizen, watching the news, how can you discern between the truth and lies?
Well, there are some things you can do. First of all, if you're getting free news, be suspicious. If anything is free, you've got to know the source. Now, there are certain online news sites which are free, which is fine. But if you can, you can go to a paid subscription service where you can rely upon the quality of the news that you're getting. That's one thing. Have different sources. Like as a journalist, you try to have two sources at least for every piece of information. Well, as a consumer of news, as a reader of news, maybe you need to do the same. If something seems strange to you, then is it being reported anywhere else separately? Or these are the things that you can do. But it's difficult, and I think that one of the problems that we face as journalists is that we don't have a largely literate news audience anymore, because people are getting their news from Facebook and YouTube and other platforms where there is no journalist between the event and the reader. And the journalists had this role of being gatekeepers of the news, but also of being fact checkers. So I think we have a job to do with people in school and young people, of educating people to be careful consumers of news and not just run off with the first piece of information and believe it, because there are bad actors out there that maliciously plant
Yes.
false information, disinformation, in order to either discredit opponents, or we've seen it,
Yeah.
influence elections. Look, we have loads of examples
Exactly.
of people using social media to affect elections, referendums, and these people's intention are not necessarily in our best interest.
Yeah, that's a fact. So, having been a journalist for many years, would you say you like print or digital better?
Oh, look, I started out in wire service news reporting. That's to say, the old, they still exist, agencies like Reuters and the Associated Press. And those were the fast, the speediest ways of getting news for many, many years. They fed news to TV stations and radio, and now it's digital. Now anybody with an iPhone can be a journalist if they want to. That's great. It means that you can go to places and you can broadcast live from a phone, right? I mean, I used to go to, I don't know, the Central African Republic or somewhere, and it would take days. You had to get there, you gather your information, and then you had to go back somewhere where you could send it. Now you can do a live shot on a phone and upload it very easily. So yeah, I like digital. I like the speed of the information, but I think that as journalists, the speed imposes certain responsibilities to get it right and to make sure that just because we've got ease of access to information that we're checking it. But I think it's much easier to be a journalist today in terms of being able to publish than it was when I started out.
Indeed, indeed. So, where do you see the future of journalism?
I think that the future of journalism lays in getting some different ways of financing news outlets. The traditional model of building news outlets on paid advertising, on classified ads, Google and Facebook have captured those markets and take a great share of advertising revenue. So now some news organizations are looking at the subscription model. You'll find more and more newspapers and news sites behind paywalls where you have to pay for a subscription.
Yes.
Some are able to do it with some advertising. The Guardian in London has done a different way where it's asking its readers voluntarily to support it, and
Yes.
apparently up to 1 million people have. But I think there's also a way of where you can get private financing to help with the financing of a longer-term investigations, which are quite expensive. And you've got in the United States, for example, you've got an outfit called ProPublica,
Yes.
which does deep dive investigative work, and that's got a blended kind of private, financing model. So I mean, I think the challenges facing journalists: how do you pay for it? Because journalists have to make a living, and news is expensive. To do the kind of longer term pieces that are required. And journalists, particularly in Asia and Africa, are really badly paid on the whole.
Yes.
And have very little job security. Often editors want to do stories, but there just isn't the money to invest in it. So I think the technology has made it easier to publish, but I think that we as the news industry have to find sustainable models to keep the lights on in the newsroom.
Okay, so two things. For those watching at home, of course, say I'm a journalist and I would like to be one of the honorees for your awards. What does it take?
Well, it's not it's not a competition. I mean, it means that we are looking for journalists that are really out there doing great work in difficult circumstances. So anybody can do this. You can be in any country, you can be covering any beat, you could be in any field. If you are informing your readers, your viewers, if you are taking risks, I mean, I don't mean, gratuitously, but if you're taking risks to bring people the news and ignoring all the threats and the libel suits and all the other things that governments can throw at you, then you'll be recognized. Your colleagues, first of all, will recognize you. Your readers will recognize you, and people come to us and say, you should look at this journalist. We don't. We have great relations with journalists around the world, so they're always telling us, and we're looking at who's doing good work.
Okay.
So definitely. One way you could also is if you get jailed, but I wouldn't recommend that you get jailed, because every year we give an award to a jailed journalist with the hope that they will get released and eventually be able to come and receive their award in person. And that has happened many times. We do a lot of advocacy on the part of journalists who have been jailed. So I think the short answer is, if you want to get this award, just do good work.
Do good work, but don't get jailed. You don't have to.
Stay safe.
Okay, another thing is for young journalists, like myself,
Yes.
who, would like to get more experience or even be part of CPJ, how can they do so?
I get more experience with press freedom and CPJ, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that we rely on at CPJ is that we report on press freedom violations around the world. We report on attacks on journalists. We report on efforts to shut journalists down. So one of the things that we really need is eyes and ears all around the world. So we work with local journalists in their own countries, and they let us know when press freedom violations are happening, when journalists are under attack. they're in touch with us. They email us, call us. We know them. We work with journalists individually. We work with journalist unions, syndicates on the ground, national organizations. We couldn't do it without them. I mean, we're a small group, relatively.
Yes.
And we have people around the world, but we don't have enough to be able to, report on some attack on a journalist in northern Nigeria. We're not going to know about that for days otherwise. So one of the ways that journalists can help us is to be in touch with us and to act as, our kind of volunteer reporters on the ground, and to let us know when they or their colleagues are in trouble or need our help.
Okay, amazing. So, any more thoughts on the awards or press freedom in general?
I would say that, that this is a crucial time, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, for press freedom. We are honoring a journalist from Tanzania. Tanzania was a country that was, doing fairly well at one point in terms of press freedom. It's been going in the wrong direction for the last few years. What I would say is that, people need to be vigilant, because these freedoms will be eroded slowly, day by day, and it's only after a while that you realize, we used to be able to read about this, or we used to be able to say this without fear of being sanctioned in some way. What's happened? And what happens is that press freedom gets eaten away little by little. Sure, when there's a big event, like there's a crackdown and journalists are in jail, or there's a military coup and the government is toppled, that's obvious. But it's the small nibbling away at the edges, whether it's by bringing suits in the courts against journalists and trying to close them down, whether it's by using regulations to shut down broadcasters, whether it's by introducing very broad security legislation that was supposed to stop terrorists but is now being used against journalists because you're saying you're supporting terrorist groups, you're spreading propaganda, whatever. These are the things that we need to be on guard against. So our awards are a way of trying to highlight that, but I would say to your viewers and audience, don't take these freedoms for granted or they'll be taken away.
Wow. Very well said. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
For sure. Stay tuned, viewers. There's more.